Well, welcome. This is the first of a 4-week webinar series introducing people to the Kabbalah. It doesn't require any preliminary knowledge or any background in the subject, so everything will be introductory. Even some more advanced students may, however, find some thing of use or value in it. So welcome to you all. So let's start with what the Kabbalah is. Now, it is, oops, where do I go down here? Well, this is not what it looks like in Hebrew. This has gotten wrong. This is, unfortunately, this is spelt wrong. And the reason it's spelt wrong, I don't know how this got there, but the Hebrew is written right to left, and this is actually written left to right. So this is spelled backwards for any of you those who know Hebrew, but this is what it might look like. And it comes, ignore this because this is incorrect, but this is kaval, the verb, which is to receive. This is interesting. It's correct on my personal laptop, but for some reason this computer reversed the Hebrew letters for who knows what reason. So I don't know if that's going to be a problem later on, but I'll sort through it. So kaval means literally to receive, and it means all sorts of things, even in the very literal sense, which is, for example, it is said, and I'm not really sure that it's true, but Kabbalah in modern Hebrew refers to reception, as in television reception. So it means that quite literally. And in a way, that's kind of useful to know, because there are two senses in which Kabbalah means receiving. One is kind of a receiving from above, that is to say, higher influences, almost like a television receiver or anything that takes broadcast signals, or receiving from the past. This is the usage you'll usually hear, and so that it means something like tradition. But it's not a bad idea to see that it's meaningful in both senses of the word. So it's a bit warm in here, so I'm going to keep mopping my brow. Anyway. And this is kind of what the mood of it is like. This is kind of a very contemplative tradition in a certain sense of the word. Contemplation meaning contemplating texts, knowledge. It's not a martial arts tradition, for example. It has a great deal to do with poring over old scriptures, particularly the Bible, and seeing meanings in them. And there are many Kabbalistic texts. Now, there is no book called the Kabbalah. That is, there are books entitled that, but the Kabbalah itself is not a book. Kabbalistic books include the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, the Zohar, Splendor, Bahir, Illumination. Those are Kabbalistic texts, but the Kabbalah itself is not a text. You may also want to know how to pronounce it. Well, I say Kabbalah. You notice that the word actually has 3 syllables, and I have heard Kabbalists themselves pronounce the word with the accent on each of them, Kabbalah, Kabbalah, Kabbalah. But the standard pronunciation in the dictionary and most American usage is to accent the second symbol, Kabbalah, as I'm doing. Don't be surprised if you hear it some other way. So it is this kind of very contemplative, text-oriented tradition. This, by the way, I believe is a Rembrandt. So the question then is, where did it come from? And there are 2 different histories of it. One is kind of a mythic history. That is to say, it was given, the teaching was given to Adam after he was expelled from Eden in order to find a way back. And Adam passed it down to his descendants, Enoch, Noah, Shem, who is Noah's son. Shem is sometimes associated with a very mysterious figure in the Bible named Melchizedek, who allegedly initiated Abraham. Now, these texts go back, huge teachings go back quite a long way, but they're not literally true. I think you probably kind of determined that this is historically where it came from. Mesopotamia and Mesopotamian influences on Judaism. For a geography lesson, Palestine, Canaan, Israel, is located southwest of Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia was home of many great civilizations, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Assyrians, who had their own occult teachings. And this was kind of prevalent in the area. The Phoenicians, who were in Lebanon, which is north of Israel, also had something similar. So the Kabbalah, as we know it, arose out of all these divergent traditions. And here's an example of how you can see this. This is the Mesopotamian tree of life, or a Mesopotamian tree of life. It comes from the palace of King Sargon II of Assyria, just around the turn of the 7th century BC. It is the case that the Bible says almost nothing kind about the Assyrians from beginning to end. But there are reasons for believing that it was influential nonetheless. The Hebrew letters, for example, as we have them, were descended from what were called the Asherite or Assyrian script. So the Hebrew letter, they are modifications of the Hebrew of the Assyrian alphabet. So the Hebrews got their alphabet from Assyria. Again, this isn't in the Bible, but it's also reasonable to assume that they got certain other things as well. Now, one thing that is noteworthy about this particular diagram, as you'll see, you'll have the 7 arrows on the right, and these correspond to 7 levels. Now, as you know, the number 7 has an enormous number of associations and resonances in occult teachings of all sorts. In many cases, it has to do with the 7 planets that are visible. Planets here meaning including the sun and the moon. But leaving that off for a minute, we'll go on to the next one, which is the Kabbalistic tree of life. And here too, it has 7 levels. There are 7 levels to this tree. This is not counted for reasons we'll eventually get to. But you'll see there's 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, 5 levels, 6 levels, 7 levels. It is not identical to this, but you can see a family resemblance. And a family resemblance is kind of all we're really talking about here. And I'm not going to go any further into the history of the Kabbalistic tradition, because I say there are 2 versions, and only somewhat later do they actually converge. For example, the Sefer Yetzirah is the oldest Kabbalistic text. Is traditionally attributed to Abraham, who lived around 1900 BC. No serious mainstream scholar believes this because we don't know anything about Abraham, and there was no Hebrew language as such in 1900 BC. There was the language that later became Hebrew was at the time still a West Canaanite dialect. So again, there's the legendary history, which is worth taking into account, but also the factual history. And I'm going to emphasize more the latter, although the resonances from the, shall we say, mythic history are pretty interesting as well. Here's yet another version. And this tells us a little bit more. This is by a contemporary British Kabbalist named Warren Kenton, who writes under the name Zev Ben Shimon Halevi, and this is his drawing. It's in one of his books. And this thing here, basically, well, anyway, this says nothing, ain. So, if you were in the process of manifesting a world, well, you start with nothing, right? We're talking about creation from nothing, so you start with nothing. The next, as they say, level of negative existence is Ein Sof. This is Ein, and this is Sof, and this is no limit, meaning the infinite. So you are already starting to talk about processes of manifestation here. For example, you now have, even hypothetically, you've posited something, even though you don't have it yet, called a limit. And of course, nothing can exist without a limit. All right. So those are the first two levels of negative existence. And in order for anything to, here is below is, this says tzimtzum, although you can't read it, I think, even if you can read Hebrew. And it means contraction or withdrawal. This is a major Kabbalistic idea, and it means that, in a sense, well, if God is everywhere, does that leave room for anything else? And the idea here is that there's a kind of contraction of the divine that allows manifestation to occur. So this Ein, this nothingness, is symbolized by the black, and the last veil of negative existence is what you call Ein Sof Or, which is infinite light, and you see that here, which is again not easy to read, even if you know Hebrew. Infinite light. Well, that's actually rather a curious concept, because here are the three veils of negative existence: Ein Sof, no limit, infinite light. Now, this is a somewhat paradoxical concept, because infinite light. Well, light is for seeing, but if light is infinite, how can you see anything? I mean, if you just imagine that everything is just pure, brilliant white light, and sometimes occultists are told to visualize that for one reason or another. Well, very good, but if everything is infinite white light, what are you going to see? Because everything is infinite white light. But I think you can take it to mean something like this, meaning that all is light. Now, seeing is possible. If you go back, this is still part of negative existence, but now it's the last level of negative existence. So something can begin. Now, these are all very abstract ideas, and they are kind of necessity impossible to conceive or describe totally. And in a certain sense, they will always be somewhat inaccurate, which is why you see certain, esoteric teachings seem to kind of say the same thing, but kind of not say the same thing. Well, that's because all of saying things is itself limited and restricted, particularly at these levels. So in a sense, you're kind of talking of veils. Well, what is a veil at that level? We're talking about nothing. But it's still useful to contemplate this kind of thing. And one reason to do so is not only to just understand some particular theory, but to be able to expand the capacities of your mind, at least to conceive possibly of things like that. And so broaden the mind's range. It has a kind of practical effect, as well as a matter of imparting information. So, you need something light to see, but there's another thing you need to see. There are always, anything that is seen involves two elements. Someone who sees and something that is seen. There is nothing that can be seen that doesn't involve those two things. We don't even know yet what these things are, but we have to at least posit that these exist. And this is where it all starts. Someone who sees is a self. We're using this in a very, very broad sense. It's not necessarily a personal sense, a self or an ego self, but there is a seer, and then there is something that is seen, and other. Here's a possible theosophical analog, because you will see theosophical texts talking about spirit versus matter. And in kind of their basic meanings, it's very difficult to find this contrast terribly enlivening. For one thing, if spirit and matter are so absolutely separate, what possible thing do they have to do with each other? They're like running on parallel tracks. This is for those of you who like philosophy is one of the problems of Descartes' philosophy, which we won't go into here, but he calls something, the self that he calls is called the res cogitans, the thinker, and res extensa is what's perceived, spirit and matter, but he doesn't do a terribly good job of figuring out or explaining why these things should even relate to one another. But we do because this necessarily involves a relationship. If they weren't both there, you wouldn't see anything. In a sense, this is all extremely basic, but it is also very abstruse. Now, the couple of ideas that I've talked about, and covered in the last few slides are discussed a lot greater length, not in a particular Kabbalistic context, but in a book of mine called The Dice Game of Shiva, which some of you may read, have read, or may want to read. Now, anyway, you begin, once you have this self and other, manifestation begins, and it is shown in this form. This is the tree of life, which you've already seen. It consists of 10 sphirot, which roughly means principles. Sphirot is plural, the singular is sphira. Those are just standard Hebrew and singular and plural feminine forms. But you start here, which is called Keter, which is the crown, the primordial point. It is symbolized often by a point. And it is like the point in geometrical space. If you remember, a point itself is just a location, right? It has no width, depth, or height. It is just a location. It has no even size. And that is a very useful way of thinking about Keter. In a sense, nothing, it's sort of a place where you start. It is considered the highest of the sphirot and closest to God. Now, you will see this here, which is the lightning flash. And this is the way the sphirot manifests. This is called a lightning flash because it looks like a lightning flash. And also, there is an allusion to it in the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, which is very, very important in the Kabbalistic tradition. If you ever read visions, it's sometimes called the throne vision or the chariot vision of Ezekiel. If you read it and try to pay attention to it, you will find that it is almost impossible to visualize because you have eyes on wheels and everything's going on. So it's obviously the prophet had a vision that he found very, very different, difficult to describe. But one of the things he said is that there are these holy living creatures, which have a symbolism of their own. They ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. So This is sometimes said to be an allusion to this process. Malkut is final physical manifestation, that is the solid object. These are all the principles and processes in between that take us from nothing, symbolized, say, by this black space here, down to something, which is more or less the physical world we know. And the Kabbalah goes into a great deal of talking about that. I'm going to go into some of the dynamics of the tree of life. I think many of you are familiar with it to some degree or another, but I can't assume that you are, and it's sometimes even the ones who know it pretty well may find some useful information here. So here we have the tree of life again, right? We have 3 pillars, and this is the middle pillar, which is called the pillar of consciousness or mildness. This is the pillar of force or mercy, expansion. This is the pillar of form, severity, restriction, limitation. So you have expansion, contraction, and something that mediates between the two. This particular one, Hesed, literally means mercy. This one, Gevura, literally means strength. Sometimes it's called judgment or fear. It's the limiting factor, which we'll get into further. But so you have force and you have form. And for anything to exist, even an idea, even something as abstract as an idea, you have to have a certain kind of energy behind it, and it has to have a certain form, a certain thought structure to it. So this is the basic dynamic. Consciousness is kind of building between the two. Now, there are moral elements in this as well, as you can get to it. And if you just see this right now, just these two things, suddenly you understand something about the Bible, which is not, or particularly the Hebrew Bible, which is not otherwise terribly clear. Because God is sometimes merciful, sometimes wrathful. And this, in a sense, explains this, because both of these aspects are, essential to creation and manifestation. As it says, all of our days are spent in thy wrath. Well, that's limitation. All of our days are spent. That's from the 90th Psalm. And all our days, in a sense, are spent in the wrath of God, because wrath, in the sense, means kind of limitation, restriction, severity, and or if you want to talk about it in more plain terms, a school of hard knocks, which is life. So all our days are spent in thy wrath. Means something a little bit different. The God of the Old Testament is often considered to be kind of childlike and capricious and, not very, shall we say, evolved. But I think there's more going on than that. And it's much truer, in a sense, to reality, because if there is the one out of which everything arises, it is both light and dark, good and evil, so on and so on. That's radical monotheism. Christianity is not radically monotheistic in that sense. And that would be another long webinar of its own. Now I'm going to go through each of these sphirot. Remember, sphirot is the plural and sphira is the singular. Incidentally, I will point out, hey, Keter is spelt this way here and this way here. There are a lot of different transliterations of Hebrew words, and they have to do with certain communities of Jews have different pronunciations. Moreover, the pronunciation that was used when the Bible was written is no longer used pretty much by anybody except academic scholars. So this letter, th, was pronounced th in the time of King David, but modern Jews tend to pronounce it, most modern Jews pronounce it just as a T. So you are going to see these variations not only between this chart and what I've written, but between any of these and plenty of other books you may have on hand. That's just an inexactitude in the transliteration of the Hebrew, and well, you can get used to it. It's not that difficult to figure out. So we said that this was the point of origin. Here is another mystical name for it. This actually comes out of a book by a British occultist named Dion Fortune, whose book, The Mystical Kabbalah, was very, very influential. It was published in the 30s. Her system is a little different from the one that I'm setting out here, but the basic outline, like for example, this tree of life, is the same. So the white head, and one image for it is an ancient king seen in profile. Now, what does that mean? Well, you're only seeing half of it because Keter is half manifest and half unmanifest. So symbolically, that refers to that. Then there's the Ancient of Days. Now, this appears in the Bible exactly once in the book of Daniel. And this refers to what Christians would call God the Father. Who God the Son was is a long issue, which you'll have to watch some webinars or read some of my books to discuss, so I know. But the name, the Ancient of Days, appears in the book of Daniel. Now here, these have planetary associations. These three, or these four, are unseen planets. And these spheroid are, as it's called, unmanifest sphere. So Neptune is the planet associated with it. Neptune is kind of considered to be, in a sense, the veil of illusion. Well, what is the veil of illusion in this context? All of manifest reality. The Kabbalists also said that there are different names of God, which are all in the Bible, and that these names reflect different aspects of God that are connected with these spherot. And there was a Kabbalist in the 16th century named Moses Cordovero who said the names of God are not associated with the spherot. God forbid. The names are the spherot. And that is true at a level we'll talk about in another lesson. This is usually the way. This is actually not a completely correct translation of this, although practically everybody uses it. But why it's incorrect is a technical point that I can explain if somebody asks me about it later on, but I'm not going to talk about it here. The second principle is Chokhmah, which literally means wisdom, and it means primordial activity. That's still very undirected. It's like almost like an explosion, a primordial explosion. It's very tempting, by the way, particularly with these upper two spherot, to use the metaphor of the Big Bang, because everything was compressed into a space the size of an electron or whatever, 14 billion years ago, and then for reasons that are never quite clear, everything kind of just exploded at once. Well, those are good ways of thinking of Keter and Chokhmah if you don't make the mistake of literalizing. That is to say, Keter is just not the point at the Big Bang way back when. This is all a process that continually is going on, and nothing would exist if it were not continually going on. But as a metaphor, these are perfectly good ways of thinking about these things. Every metaphor has to be even a good metaphor is partly false, because nothing is completely like something else. If it were, it would be the same thing. So whenever you look at metaphors of any sort, you always have to remember this, that they're necessarily going to be misleading. And this is something that's very, very often forgotten and just about everywhere. So in the Chinese tradition, it's Yang. Uranus is the planet associated with it, which is, astrologers will say is kind of the planet of revolution, upheaval. And this is the god name associated with it, the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh. And this is the biblical figure associated with it, Adam. Keter doesn't have a biblical figure associated with it except God himself. So we go on to Binah, which is this. And this means understanding, literally, and its primordial form. It is limitation. Yin, Saturn, Elohim, Eve. Here are a couple of other names from the Western occult tradition: the bright fertile mother and the dark sterile mother. This and the association with Saturn tell us a lot about Binah. Binah is, there's one Kabbalist who said, in Binah there is no severity, but she is the mother of all severity. Hey, guess what? This is the pillar of severity, remember? She's associated with Saturn. The male and female aspects of the gods are all to be taken with a certain amount of, shall we say, lightness, because all of these basic principles have both masculine and so, just because it's Binah and it's on the passive side of the filler doesn't mean, so to speak, that it has to be a girl. Saturn, or Kronos in Greek mythology, ate his children. And Goya, the Spanish painter, had a very vivid of this, Saturn kind of chomping on one of his offspring, kind of like it was a popsicle or something. I'm sure some of you have seen it. And that's because everything that comes into manifestation has to come out of it again. This is a process. It goes down and it all goes back up into the absolute. So, in a sense, it is life-giving and it is also life-taking. Called the bright fertile mother because everything goes through it. The dark sterile mother because, well, not everything goes through it. Binah has to do with, in a sense, yes or no, possibilities that can manifest or possibilities that cannot manifest. This is another long topic, but in the Kabbalistic tradition, there are what are called the kings of Edom, which were ruled before there was a king in Israel. This is in Genesis 37, and this refers to, again, a long subject, these refers to possibilities that can never manifest, that they just kind of fly out like sparks in a hammer, from a hammer, Smith's hammer, in one Kabbalistic text puts it. So now here, the next one is Da'at, which means knowledge, and it is also the abyss. You notice there's this funny little shadow on it. Well, Da'at isn't really a sphera like the others. There are 10 sphero, and if you count all these circles, there are 11, and this is the one that doesn't count. So it's called a non-sphera, paradoxically. It is an interval in which that has to be crossed from the unmanifest to the manifest. Notice, though, so there's no path here, right? So it is, in a sense, called the abyss. In occult terms, it's the dweller on the threshold. You could say psychologically, this level of the psyche, it's the dweller on the threshold. It's Pluto is associated with it. And guess what? Well, you may have heard that they decided that Pluto isn't a planet. Sort of, I guess it's a planet, except it's not really a planet. Well, doesn't that fit? Because this is a sphere, except it's not really a sphere. It's an almost perfect reflection of that fact. And psychologically, the dweller on the threshold is it's kind of, shall we say, a sphincter, which is a sort of graphic way of saying that it is the thing that keeps all of the elements of the unmanifest, in psychological terms, unconscious, from becoming conscious. And if this is blown apart or opened artificially, some say that this is a danger of many drugs, that this, it just kind of disarms this and everything comes pouring down and you may not be able to absorb it. You may or may not be able to absorb it. So dweller on the threshold. If you're interested in this figure, there's a novel written in the 19th century called Zanoni by Edward Bulwer Lytton, in which one of the characters gets into trouble with this dweller on the threshold. If you want another literary take on all of this, there is a novel called Under the Volcano, written during World War II. It's not about World War II, by Malcolm Lowry. The hero is a failed Kabbalistic magician, and he falls into this abyss. How do we know this? He said, I'm falling into the abyss between Hesed and Bina. I mean, the symbolism is that explicit. It's a great novel and worth reading apart from its Kabbalistic association, but it does have an enormous amount of Kabbalistic symbolism in it. Go on. Hesed is mercy, expansion, Jupiter. Jupiter is the great benefic of the planets. Abraham is associated with it, the patriarch Abraham, who's noted for his hospitality, his mercy, and El is the god name associated with it. So these are kind of the things. It is, in a sense, benevolence. It's another name for it in Hebrew is Gedula, which means greatness. The next one is Gevura, which is the opposite, which is it means strength, but it also has meanings of severity, judgment, and fear. Isaac is associated with Gevura, and at some point or another in the Bible, God is referred to as the fear of Isaac. Well, if God, talked your father into trying to sacrifice you, I guess you would be afraid of God too a little bit. So that certainly stands to reason in terms of the biblical story. The planet name, which I've neglected to put here, is Mars. So you have Jupiter, you have Mars. Yah is the name associated with it. Let's see. And we go on to Tiferet. Tiferet is the middle point of everything. It is connected to everything on the tree except this, which is physicality. In psychological terms, it's the high self. Oh, some of you may be interested in Jung. All right, this is what he calls the capital S self, and this is what he calls the ego in his psychological terms. How do I know that? Because he says so in one of his own books. I mean, he explicitly says so the self is Tiferet and the ego is Yesod. So I think that's pretty good authority. He's associated with Christ. Here's the Son of God. Remember, this is the Father, the Son. Jacob is the patriarch, and it is also associated with the Son in the S-U-N sense of the word two. Go to Netzach, which victory, well, it's an often used translation of it. It doesn't really work very well. Eternity is a little bit more accurate in terms of what it actually does, but it has to do with cyclical repetition. Now, you remember, this is the pillar of force, so this is kind of unconstrained expansion. This is controlled expansion. This is, shall we say, circular or repetitious expansion. Inertia, because inertia is the tendency of an object in motion to stay in motion as well, unless acted on by an equal and opposing force. That is kind of what it is. Moses was associated with Netzach, and so is the planet Venus. Venus is concerned with reproduction, right? So this is the cyclical repetition of the species, which is what she has to do with Venus. Yahweh Tzevaot, which is Yahweh of hosts, is the biblical name associated with it. Next one is Hod, or I suppose technically you really ought to pronounce it Hod. I never I don't know, I learned to pronounce it the other way, and I've gotten used to it. This means, again, it's not such a great term for it. It literally means glory, but it's probably better translated by this Greek word doxa, which also means glory, but it also means appearance, how things appear to you. One of the meanings of this word is opinion. That is to say, what is your opinion? Your opinion is how something seems to you, right? So it's associated with pattern recognition, and the planet Mercury or Hermes. Well, how do you know what a cup looks like? Well, it's because it looks like lots of other cups you've seen in the rest of your life. So it is intelligence in that sense. In a sense, it's learned recognition, and this is learned response. I mean, they're all, Aaron, well, Hod is, as we say, well, we could almost say the brains of the operation. Aaron is the one who actually speaks before Pharaoh, because Moses, for some reason, has a speech impediment or something of the sort. It's rather mysterious. Moses, the lawgiver, doesn't speak. It kind of is Hod, that is to say, Netzach is inarticulate, and this is the articulate half. Without, again, wanting to force any analogies here, always a dangerous thing to do, you could probably think of this to some degree as the right brain, the inarticulate right brain, and the articulate left brain. Again, be careful going too far with these things. Yesud, well, I already told you it was the ego. Got it here. Image, person, El Hai Shaddai, which not entirely accurately is usually translated as the living and almighty, the moon. Joseph is the patriarch with his coat of many colors, because it's about the ego, as I said, the persona, and the moon. And the moon has a lot of connections with this, because, let's go back to Jung, if this is the ego, the conscious self, well, the moon has a light side and a dark side. The light side, the side you see, is your conscious ego. There's the part that you don't want to see, that you always hide, which Jung calls the shadow. It's the dark side of the moon. So this analogy is actually pretty apt, and it's almost impossible to think that Jung wasn't thinking of that to some degree at some point or another. Maybe he explicitly mentions it somewhere. Right? And this is the last. This is Malkut, the earth. Kingdom, solidity, manifestation, material. This is the God name, Adonai Haaretz, the Lord of the earth, David, and the earth is the planet associated with it. I've described this as a process of manifestation. To get back home, so to speak, it's going to be a process of ascent. This is, shall we say, the physical body. This is the ego. This is your rational mind. These are your instincts. This is your true self. Oh, guess what? Well, you have to go, if you get to your true self, where do you have to go? You have to go through this path, which is sometimes called the path of honesty. And means going through the shadow, the dark side of the moon. I have to wonder on a completely different matter if certain incidents in the United States are not reflecting the United States itself going through a confrontation with the shadow, without getting any more specific about it than that. Now, I'm going to leave this here, and I am only going to mention this as this is an equally important idea, but, what we've done now is quite enough for 1 hour. And the only thing I'm going to point out about this is that there are 4 worlds. These are the names: Absolute, the divine, Bria, spirit, Sira, form, Asiya, materiality. Colors are white, traditional colors white, blue, purple, red. Oh, by the way, why do you think the Israeli flag is white and blue? This symbolism appears everywhere in the Bible. The priests are supposed to wear tassels. The priests in the temple are supposed to wear tassels, and these tassels threads are pure linen, that is to say white, blue, purple, and red. So there's an allusion to the four worlds even in that. And you could well ask whether the Kabbalah was based on the Bible or the Bible was based on the Kabbalah. I would tend to say the latter, but that would be a long discussion. Bria is the realm of spirit or creation. That's literally what it means. Yetzirah is the world of form, psyche. Asiya is materiality. Oh, by the way, the book of Genesis. Well, a lot of you know that there are two creation accounts in the book of Genesis, one in chapter 1 and the other in chapter 2. And everyone kind of wonders why. Why does it have these two different creation accounts? It doesn't make any sense. The standard answer is that, well, there were two original stories and somebody glommed them together, which may well be the case, but why would he do that? Well, chapter 1 uses the word bara, which means create, and it refers to this level. Chapter 2 uses the verb yatsar, meaning to form, which has to do with this level. So the creation is at two completely different levels. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Where does materiality come in? Well, that doesn't really come in until after the fall. The word asiya comes in when God makes coats of skin for Adam and Eve. What are your coats of skin? Well, you're wearing one, and even you were wearing one even if you're sitting at your terminal stark naked. These are your coats of skin. I'm going to stop here. There's another 10 minutes, so fire away. While I'm waiting for the questions to come up, it is possible, by the way, to equate these levels with theosophical schema. You know, this would be the physical, this would be kind of the etheric, where the psyche interpenetrates the body, this would kind of be the astral level, this is the level of probably buddhi, intellect. Okay, can you comment a bit? Can they read each other's question? Thank you. Okay. How did I become interested in the study of the Kabbalah? Well, I guess I've always been. I remember my father was interested in this when I was a boy, and he had some books around. I became interested myself. I remember even buying him a book on the Kabbalah as a Father's Day present once, which I inherited. But the real interest kind of came when I was a student at Oxford between 1978 and 1980, when there was a small group on the Kabbalah. I was part of it, and I'm still in touch with a lot of people from that circle. One of the people who started it was Warren Kenton, whom I mentioned earlier. And that's one, although not the only reason I'm using the system that appears in his books. It's still the one that makes the most sense to me. So I, kind of studied it and practiced it ever since then, with punctuated by lots of other traditions as well. The Kabbalah actually gives you a fairly good way of, in a sense, measuring your, where you are on the spiritual path. I'll tell you a weird experience. I remember I was at a Kabbalistic workshop, England, Buxton, Derbyshire, just before I moved back to the United States in 1980, and the instructor said, "You are Gevura." So, I don't know, I'd never particularly thought of myself that way, but it did lead me to think, well, if I am that heavily balanced there, maybe I ought to go a little more in this direction. And so one thing I did, which is I studied a much more Hasidic, merciful teaching called A Course in Miracles, which definitely, helped me move more in that direction. So it gives you a way of showing your imbalances, and even if you're not even studying the same tradition, it gives you some way of saying, well, I need to move a little more here. So if you memorize this and internalize this, it answers a great deal. Oh, the body. Here are the parts of the body. All right. Well, let me get on the next one. It is very complex. Where is the seat of research today? Well, until about 50 or 60 years ago, there was very little academic research on the Kabbalah. It was all pretty much practitioners. Since then, the scholarship, particularly on the Jewish side of it, has really burgeoned. So there are scholars who study the Kabbalah in many, many major universities, both here and in Israel and in Europe. So there's no centered seat of research. There are many different Kabbalah lines and teachings and centers, some of them highly Jewish, highly even Orthodox, others more part of the Western occult tradition, which I've alluded to also, which is non-Jewish. There has been a Christian Kabbalah. I remember I said this is God the Father, this is God the Son. Well, in a sense, we could say this is God the Holy Spirit. So Christians have studied Kabbalah and practiced it since at least 1486, and probably earlier, except we have no real evidence of it. So this has been part of the non-Jewish world for a long, long time. You will hear sometimes say, people will talk about the occult philosophy of the Renaissance. This was basically common knowledge among intellectuals in the time of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's worldview is based on this occult knowledge of its time, which was pretty much the province of every learned individual. And the Kabbalah was very, very much part of it. Whether Shakespeare was familiar with the Kabbalah as such, some people have argued it. There's a long speech in The Merchant of Venice about the quality of mercy, which is Hesed, which some say reflects that. Whether Shakespeare himself knew this particular system, although it was around in that time, not something I would say, but the more general occult philosophy, which included ideas like these, I'm virtually certain he was familiar with and was the basis of his worldview. I assume you will deal with various books at a later date. I'm not sure what books you actually mean here. Maybe you could clarify that a little bit. I'll try to answer it if you do. Basic books. Well, my own book, Hidden Wisdom, A Guide to the Western Inner Tradition, has a chapter on the Kabbalah, which it would be a very good introduction to it. Warren Kenton, writing under the name Zev Ben Shimon Halevi, Halevi, has a kind of 8x11 kind of picture book called Kabbalah, Tradition of Hidden Knowledge, which is useful not only for setting out some of the basic ideas, but so I was distracted by this question here, but also in a lot of graphic form. Well, Barbara's asking, well, I have material that we can print. Well, let me think about that. Yeah, I keep hearing people saying, they like handouts. I went to actually a very course on the visual display of quantitative information a few weeks ago, and the professor is very distinguished in that field. Said, yeah, people love handouts, always give handouts. I don't. I always myself just generally leave the handouts on the chair. So, but let's see if I can do something. Oh, he's interested in the text that I'm talking about, the Zohar Sefer Yetzir. Yeah, I will talk those in later lessons. But I will. The Zohar is probably the biggest, in many ways, many different ways, Kabbalistic work It was written mostly in the late 13th century by a Kabbalist named Moses de Leon in Spain. It may, at this point now, this year, have been finally fully translated into English. There's a scholar named Daniel Channon Matt who's translated the full Zohar, and I believe the final volume is out this year. That is to say, volume 12. So it is a huge, huge thing. The Sefer Yetzirah, it means the Book of Formation. If you remember, so to a certain extent, it's talking about this level. It is the oldest Kabbalistic text. I am not going to, I don't know how much I'm going to say about it. The Sefer Yetzirah is very important. And as you know, I imagine, I'm giving kind of a National Lodge correspondence course on, hey, there you go for your handouts. I will discuss the Sefer Yetzirah more in that. It's somewhat more abstruse, although it's more basic, and it's, shall we say, much less well understood than the more familiar concepts. Another important text is the Bahir, the Book of Illumination, which was produced in Provence, in the south of France, probably in the 11th century. Those are some of the major texts. The Sefer Yetzirah was probably written, I don't know, sometime between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD. The others were written in medieval times, and that's not a coincidence because it was in medieval times, like say between the 10th and 14th centuries, that this tradition came together in this form. It certainly had been known in other forms. You remember, for example, the Assyrian Tree of Life. If you want another Kabbalistic symbol, which also has 7, there is the menorah. The menorah is a 7-branched candelabrum. And, well, what does it symbolize? It's the level of 7, the 7 spirits before the throne, the 7 planets, so on, so on, so on. So that is another, valuable thing about learning the Kabbalah, is that this can serve very well as a kind of filing system of symbolism. I mean, you've already seen, well, you've got biblical patriarchs here. You've also got the planets. It is useful in studying astrology, and there are Kabbalistic astrologers, people who explicitly relate these to various astrological aspects. For example, if you have, this is Mars, this is Jupiter, and here's this path between them. So if Mars and Jupiter are badly aspected in your chart, that is to say they have a kind of tense relationship like a square or an opposition, it could point to some kind of blockage here. So you can use this in a sense for personal insight as well. There's certainly meditative practices associated with the Kabbalah, which I'm not going to go in this class, and probably allude to a little bit in other classes. But there are many, many varieties of it. So I think I'm going to stop here because it's 3 o'clock. So I will be back, same time, same station next week. Thank you for coming.